In the shadowed valleys of the Carpathians, whispers of an ancient mirror lingered like fog on forgotten altars, drawing seekers to a village where folklore blurred the line between truth and illusion. Mara Ellison, a journalist scarred by secrets she couldn't unearth, arrived seeking answers to a legend that promised to shatter illusions or souls. The mist clung to the Carpathian foothills like a living shroud, curling through the narrow lanes of the village as Mara Ellison stepped from the rattling bus. It softened the edges of the thatched roofs and blurred the faces of the few souls who lingered in the twilight, their eyes sharp despite the haze. She adjusted her notebook, the leather cover damp already, and approached the cluster of villagers outside the weathered inn, 3 women in woolen shawls, an old man with a pipe clenched in his teeth. "Evening," she said, her voice steady, forcing a smile that felt foreign in the chill air. "I'm Mara, a writer from the city, just passing through, gathering stories of old ways." The women exchanged glances, their postures tightening like drawn bowstrings. The old man puffed smoke into the fog, watching her through half-lidded eyes. "Stories," he muttered, his accent thick as the mud underfoot. "What kind of stories does a stranger want from here?" Mara hesitated, the weight of their scrutiny pressing in. She could feel the unspoken barrier, the wariness that seeped from them, like the mist itself, coiling, elusive, born of generations who knew better than to trust outsiders. One woman, her face etched with lines like cracked porcelain, leaned forward slightly. "We've tales enough of our own, winds that whisper secrets at night, bells that toll for the lost. But some whispers, they bite back." The group shifted, murmurs rippling low. Mara caught fragments, a shadow in the chapel ruins that twisted like regret, a betrayal long ago when someone spoke too freely and misfortune followed. No names, no direct paths, just these vague echoes, painting the air with unease. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the distant silhouette of the abandoned steeple, as if the village itself conspired to hide its heart. She probed gently, skirting the forbidden core. Betrayals? Like when trust breaks in the old families. Her pulse quickened. The stories tugged at her, not as myth, but as something alive, stirring doubts she'd long buried under layers of objectivity. The old man nodded slowly, his pipe glowing faintly. One spoke out of turn, and the shadows grew longer. "Place up the hill, best left to the mist." His eyes bored into hers, challenging, doubting her motives. Would she stir what should stay sleeping? Mara's wariness ebbed into a quiet resolve, the chill sharpening her focus. These weren't superstitions to dismiss. They were warnings wrapped in fog, igniting her need to pierce the veil. She thanked them softly, stepping back as the group dispersed into the gathering dusk, their whispers trailing like smoke. But as the mist veiled the path ahead, a question lingered in the damp air. Could she prove she meant no harm, or would her questions only summon the trouble they feared? As twilight deepened into evening, the sun bled into the Carpathian ridges as Mara's battered jeep rattled over the rutted path into Veritek, the remote village cloaked in a shroud of mist that clung like a living thing. Sunset painted the fog in bruised purples and golds, turning the world into a half-remembered dream. Distant bells tolled from the old chapel's steeple, low, resonant chimes that vibrated through the air, echoing off the timbered roofs and into her chest. Each peal felt like a summons, pulling her deeper into the legend she'd chased across continents, the mirror that whispered truths no one wanted to hear. She killed the engine outside the weathered inn, the silence broken only by those insistent bells, their rhythm a slow heartbeat of the village's guarded soul. Mara pulled out her notebook, fingers trembling slightly in the chill, and began jotting notes, the first whispers she'd gleaned from a roadside informant hours back. "It shows you broken, at midnight. Don't look." Doubt gnawed at her. Was she just another fool chasing shadows? Or could this unravel the superstition? Her pen scratched faster, capturing the fog's damp kiss on her skin, the way it muffled footsteps and voices alike. Venturing toward the chapel's silhouette, she spotted him. Father Iban, stooped and silver-haired, silhouetted against the fading light. He stood at the arched doorway, arms crossed like a barrier, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. Villagers nearby, huddled figures in woolen shawls, shot her wary glances, their murmurs dying as the bells rang again, deeper now, as if warning her away. "Outsider," Iban said, his voice gravelly, laced with the accent of ancient hills. "The road ends here for curiosity like yours. What brings a city woman to our fog?" Mara straightened, heart pounding against the external press of the mist coiling at her ankles, the bell's tolls syncing with her pulse. Doubt flickered. Would they see her as predator, not seeker? But she met his gaze, voice steadying. "I'm Mara Ellison, a journalist. I've heard the stories of the mirror in your chapel. Not to mock, Father, but to understand, to record what it's done to your people. Let me hear the history from you." He paused, the bells swelling in the distance, their echoes weaving through the fog like threads of communal memory. The villagers edged closer, their suspicion a tangible weight. But Iban's face softened fractionally, etched lines deepening. Truth isn't given lightly. It demands proof of intent. The fog thickened, blurring the chapel's edges, hiding whatever secrets it cradled. Mara felt the pull, the bells urging her on, or perhaps drowning her inner voice in their clamor. She nodded, resolve hardening against the doubt's retreat. "Then test me. But the legend won't stay buried forever." The question hung unspoken in the mist. Could she prove her presence honest? Or would the village's shadows swallow her whole? With the priest's initial caution lingering in the air, Mara returned to the chapel later that night. The chapel's air hung thick with the scent of damp stone and old incense, shadows pooling like ink in the corners of the nave. Mara Ellison stood at the threshold, her notebook clutched like a shield, the weight of the village's wary glances still clinging to her coat. Father Iban emerged from the vestry, his face etched with lines that spoke of too many midnights, a single candle flickering in his gnarled hand. "And there are conditions. Swear you won't reveal its face to another soul before the hour strikes. No sketches, no photographs. Touch it only if you're prepared to face what stares back. Not the village's ghost, but your own." Mara's pulse quickened, the external pressure of his gaze pressing like the fog outside. She could walk away, preserve her objectivity, let the story fade into myth, or step forward, honoring this ritual of restraint. The choice loomed, heavy as the chapel's bells, tolling faintly in the distance. Wariness gnawed at her. What if this was just superstition, a barrier to keep her at bay? But the candle's light flickered again, mirroring the flicker of doubt in her mind, urging her toward resolve. "I swear," she said finally, her voice gaining edge. "No revelations until midnight claims them. I'll respect the boundaries." Iban studied her, the tension easing from his shoulders, like mist burning off at dawn. He nodded once, curt. "Then at the stroke of 12, the chapel door will be yours. But heed this warning. The mirror doesn't lie. It shatters illusions. He turned, the candle's flame trailing shadows behind him, leaving Mara alone with the echo of her promise. Was respect for their traditions enough to bridge the chasm between outsider and kin? The question lingered, unanswered, as the wind whispered through the cracks. As the night settled deeper, the mist clung to the village like a shroud as Mara pushed through the narrow alley behind the chapel, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The air hummed with the distant toll of bells, a low, mournful cadence that seemed to echo the weight of unspoken secrets. She had heard of Nadia from a wary innkeeper, a girl who wandered the edges of the wood, her eyes hollowed by what she'd seen. Now, there she was, perched on a weathered stone bench beneath a gnarled oak, staring at the fog as if it held answers. "Nadia?" Mara's voice was soft, tentative, cutting through the hush like a whisper in confession. The girl didn't startle, but her shoulders tensed, fingers twisting the frayed hem of her shawl. Silence stretched between them, thick and probing, a barrier woven from years of guarded solitude. Mara sat at the bench's far end, respecting the space, her notebook tucked away. She wouldn't push. That much she knew from the villagers' sidelong glances, their murmured warnings. "Why come here?" Nadia's words finally emerged, edged with suspicion, her gaze flicking to Mara's face like a shadow testing light. "To scribble our ghosts into your paper, make us spectacles for outsiders." Mara met her eyes, the chill of the evening seeping into her bones. "I'm not here to steal stories. I want to understand. The mirror. It's pulled at me since I heard the tales. If you've seen it, really seen it, I need to know what it does to a person." Nadia's laugh was a brittle thing, swallowed by the surrounding quiet. The silence returned, heavier now, wrapping around them like the fog's tendrils. It wasn't empty. It pulsed with the unsaid, the wounds Nadia carried in her withdrawn gaze. Minutes passed, marked only by the rustle of leaves and the faint creak of the bench as Nadia shifted. Finally, she spoke, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the words might shatter the air. It was midnight in the chapel attic. Father Eben had locked it away, but I slipped in, curious. Like you, the mirror stood there, framed in cracked oak, its surface like black ice. I looked, and it wasn't me staring back. Not the girl who laughs with her sisters. It showed fragments, my anger at Mother for leaving, the fear that I'd shatter like she did, pieces scattering into nothing. No monster, just me, broken open. The whispers started then, from the glass, pulling at those hidden hurts until I couldn't tell where I ended. As Nadia spoke, her wariness thawed, words flowing with a raw intimacy that bridged the gap between them. Mara listened, transfixed, the girl's confession stirring echoes in her own chest. A long-buried grief over her sister's accident, the emotional walls she'd built to stay objective. Vulnerability flickered in her, unbidden, as Nadia's eyes softened, seeing not a probing journalist, but a kindred seeker. "It's up there still," Nadia murmured, nodding toward the chapel's shadowed spire. "But beware, the reflection doesn't lie. It demands you carry what it shows." The silence settled again, softer now, laced with tentative trust. Mara felt the weight of it. Was she ready to peer in, not just as observer, but bearer of the truths it unearthed? The fog thickened, and the bells tolled once more, leaving the question unanswered in the gathering dusk. With hours stretching toward midnight, Mara hunched over the scarred wooden table in her rented room, the single oil lamp casting elongated shadows that danced like hesitant ghosts across the walls. Outside, the Carpathian fog pressed against the window panes, muffling the world into a gray hush, broken only by the distant toll of village bells. 11 strikes, each one a slow hammer against her pulse. She flipped through her notebook, her pen scratching notes on the psychology of mirrors. Lacan's mirror stage, where the infant first glimpses a unified self, only to realize the illusion of wholeness. Jung's shadows, lurking in reflective surfaces, demanding confrontation. Rational anchors, she told herself, to tether the swirling folklore she'd gathered all day. But the words blurred, as anticipation coiled in her chest, a trembling wire pulled taut. What if the mirror didn't distort the village legends, but her own fractures, the ones she'd buried after the accident? Her sister's shattered laugh echoing in empty rooms, the guilt that had armored her heart against stories like this. She jotted anxious details. Nadia's withdrawn gaze during their interview, the way the young woman's fingers twisted like roots seeking escape. Father Eben's murmured warning about solitude at midnight, his eyes holding secrets older than the chapel stones. The clock on the mantel ticked relentlessly, its brass face a cold eye staring back, each second amplifying the fog's whisper. Stay, wait, reveal. Her hand shook as she pulled out her phone. The screen's glow a fragile light in the dimness. A quick message to Nadia. Heading to the chapel soon. I'll be careful. Promise to listen before I look. Sent. No reply yet, but the act steadied her. A thread of connection amid the isolation. Research couldn't depersonalize this. It only sharpened the internal crack, the fear that objectivity was her greatest lie. The bells would chime 12 soon. The threshold. What parts of her story, grief's raw edges, the suppressed ache, must she offer the glass to emerge unbroken? She closed the notebook, breath steadying into resolve. The fog thickened. The clock's hands crept onward. Midnight waited, and so would she, not as observer, but as one who dared the gaze. Earlier that evening, before the final approach, the fog clung to the chapel's stone walls like a reluctant confession, muffling the distant toll of village bells. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp wood and candle wax, the only light a flickering lantern between Mara and Nadia on the worn pew. Mara sat with her notebook balanced on her knee, pen poised but unmoving, her eyes tracing the younger woman's shadowed face. Nadia fidgeted with the frayed edge of her shawl, her gaze fixed on the floor where shadows pooled like unspoken regrets. It wasn't just the face in the mirror, Mara said softly, her voice a careful thread in the quiet. You mentioned cracks, like it showed more than what you saw on the outside. She leaned forward slightly, not pushing, but inviting, her own pulse quickening with the weight of the moment. The legend whispered through the village, like wind through cracks in the timber, the mirror that peeled back layers, exposing the fractures we pretend aren't there. Nadia's breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the shawl. You think it's simple, a ghost or some old curse? Her tone was edged, wary, as if Mara's questions were fingers prying at a fresh wound. She glanced toward the chapel door, where the night pressed in, and lowered her voice to a near whisper. It looked at me, really looked, and what it showed, it was me, but broken. The guilt I'd buried after my sister's accident. The way I'd run from it. The mirror didn't twist it. It just lit it up, made the fear feel alive, like it was waiting inside all along. Mara nodded, her pen scratching lightly now, capturing fragments without demand. She felt the pull of her own guarded heart, the journalist's armor cracking under the intimacy of Nadia's words. This wasn't data. It was a shared scar, and reporting it meant touching someone else's pain. And the guilt, did it grow stronger after? Like the reflection fed it? A pause, stretched, broken only by the faint whisper of wind slipping through the chapel's seams, carrying echoes of the bells like half-forgotten prayers. Nadia's eyes met Mara's, searching for the exploitation she feared from outsiders. But there was no hunger in Mara's gaze, only a quiet listening, a mirror of her own vulnerability. Slowly, the tension in Nadia's shoulders eased, her whisper softening into something almost confessional. Yes, it made me see how I'd let that crack widen, how the fear wasn't the mirror's doing. It was mine, hiding what I couldn't face. Telling you, it feels like inviting it back. But maybe not all truths destroy. Mara closed her notebook, the weight of responsibility settling like fog in her chest. The mirror's lure blurred in her mind. Was the horror external, or the echo of inner shards we despise? As Nadia's words hung between them, fragile and shared, Mara wondered if voicing the fracture mended it, or merely invited deeper trust, at the risk of shattering both. As midnight drew near, Mara's boots crunched softly against the frost-kissed path, each step a deliberate echo in the enveloping hush of the Carpathian night. The wind whispered through the skeletal pines, carrying the faint, mournful toll of village bells, distant guardians marking time's inexorable creep toward midnight. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the gusts, a frantic drumbeat she tried to steady, but the chill seeped into her bones like an uninvited doubt. She paused at the chapel's shadowed threshold, the ancient stone archway looming like a forgotten confession, its crevices etched with centuries of secrets. Anxiety coiled in her chest, sharp and insistent, urging her to turn back, to let the legend remain just that, a story for her notebook, untouched by the raw edge of reality. What if the wind betrayed her now, rattling the loose timbers and alerting Father Eben before she could plead her case? The desire to enter burned brighter, pulling her forward, yet the fear anchored her feet, a precarious balance on the precipice of truth. She flexed her fingers, gloved against the bite of the air, feeling the worn leather creak like old bones protesting movement. In the dim glow spilling from the chapel's cracked door, a single candle flickered on the stoop, a sentinel of wax and wick, its flame dancing erratically, casting elongated shadows that twisted across the ground like hesitant spirits. Mara watched it, mesmerized, the warm light a fragile counterpoint to the encroaching dark. It reminded her of Nadia's tale, whispered earlier by the hearth, how the mirror's gaze had unraveled her, thread by thread, until only fragments remained. Could she leave her own shadows behind? Those buried griefs from a life fractured long before this forsaken place. Drawing a breath that tasted of pine and mist, Mara transformed the tremor in her limbs into resolve. Fear wasn't a chain, but a guide, setting the cadence of her ascent, each heartbeat a step closer to revelation. The silence between her and the chapel stretched like an unspoken pact, bridging the chasm to Father Eben's wary trust, to Nadia's fragile hope. She raised her voice, soft yet firm, ready to announce herself, not as an intruder, but as one prepared for the ritual of facing what lay within. What must be surrendered to the shadows before crossing that line? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the candle's flame steadied, beckoning her onward. At the stroke of 12, the chapel's air hung thick as forgotten incense, the midnight bells tolling their hollow dirge through the fog-shrouded village. Mara Ellison stood alone before the antique mirror, its frame etched with thorns, that seemed to writhe in the candle's faltering glow. Father Eben's warnings echoed in her mind: solitude at the threshold, respect for the veil. But she had vowed it, to Nadia most of all, promising a truth that honored the fracture without exploiting it. Her notebook lay open on the weathered altar, pen poised like a fragile anchor. Heart pounding, she stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her boots, each sound amplifying the internal storm. Can I observe without becoming? Anxiety coiled in her chest, a serpent of doubt. She had come as journalist, armored in objectivity, but the mirror's surface gleamed like liquid obsidian, pulling at the edges of her resolve. Raising her gaze, she met her reflection. Not the poised woman who had arrived days ago, notebook in hand, but a fractured mosaic. The face staring back was hers, yet splintered, eyes hollowed by the car crash she never wrote about. The lover's betrayal that left her guarding her heart like a village secret. Shadows twisted within the glass, revealing not monsters, but the shards she had buried. Grief's raw edges, the fear of dissolving into the stories she chased. A whisper slithered from the frame, not words, but the echo of her own suppressed sobs, precise and piercing, laying bare the lie. I can remain untouched. The vision deepened, the candle's flame guttering as if the mirror breathed. Her reflection reached out, fingers elongating into accusing tendrils, mirroring the isolation she imposed on herself, the way she distanced Nadia with questions instead of empathy. Panic surged. Turn away, preserve the mask, let the legend stay myth, or stare deeper. The choice burned. Acknowledge these fragments, let them cut true, or shatter under their weight. Nadia's withdrawn gaze flashed in her mind, the young woman's trust a tentative bridge. Breaking it now would echo her own losses. She gripped the altar's edge, breath ragged, forcing herself to hold the stare. The distortions softened, not into horror, but clarity, a overwhelmed recognition that the boundary blurred. Observer and observed entwined. The mirror wasn't antagonist. It was reckoning. Tears blurred the glass as she snatched her pen, scribbling furiously. The fractured eyes, the whispering grief, the pull toward vulnerability. Fear was no external curse, but the courage to reclaim the hidden self. Yet, as the bells faded, one shard lingered unresolved. What pieces must she embrace fully, lest the story, and she, unravel entirely? As dawn broke through the lingering night, the chapel's shadows clung like forgotten prayers, the air thick with the echo of midnight bells, now fading into dawn's hesitant gray. Mara sat on the cold stone floor, her back against the alcove wall, the antique mirror looming inert across from her, a silent sentinel, its surface dulled to mere glass in the morning light. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her notebook from her coat pocket, the leather cover worn from weeks of skeptical scribbles. It had been her shield, this slim volume, a barrier of ink and objectivity, where legends were dissected like specimens under a lens. But now, as she flipped to a fresh page, the words from the vision clawed at her mind. The reflection hadn't shown monsters or curses. It had fractured her own face into shards of unresolved grief. The hollow eyes of a woman who'd buried her sister's death under layers of detachment, the journalist's armor forged in newsroom battles. I can remain objective. She'd always lied to herself, yet the mirror had blurred that line, pulling her from observer to the observed, her suppressed fractures bleeding into the light. Her thoughts raced, a whirlwind of stunned clarity. How to capture this without slipping back into the mask? The villagers' whispers, Nadia's haunted gaze, they demanded truth. not sanitized prose. She scribbled fragments. The way the reflections whisper had mimicked her own voice, accusing her of hiding from the pain that Nadia carried so openly. The notebook's pages filled with details, the mirror's gilded edges etched with forgotten runes, the chill that seeped into her bones like regret. A plan emerged in hasty lines, published not as myth-busting exposé, but as confession, weaving the artifact's lore with her unraveling. Nadia's presence lingered in her mind, a soft shadow from the ridge the night before. The young woman's tentative hand on her shoulder after the vision, a promise of shared burden rather than isolation. Mara paused, pen hovering, feeling that fragile support, like a thread, pulling her toward vulnerability. She wouldn't ignore the ache in her chest, the raw throb of loss mirrored back. Instead, she'd let it shape the narrative, admitting how the glass had healed as much as it haunted. Relief settled then, a quiet determination uncoiling in her chest, easing the stunned weight. But as she closed the notebook, one question hung unanswered in the dim air: how to convey this vision without shattering herself or Nadia all over again. In the morning light, as resolve took hold, the chapel's air hung heavy with the scent of damp stone and lingering incense, the village bells tolling a distant, mournful cadence outside. Mara sat at the scarred wooden table, her notebook open before her like an unburdened confession. Father Eben's eyes, shadowed under heavy brows, fixed on her with the wariness of a man who had guarded secrets too long. Nadia, beside him, clutched her shawl, her gaze flickering between hope and guarded pain, the same fracture Mara had glimpsed in the mirror's midnight gaze. "I saw it," Mara began, her voice steady, but laced with the raw edge of revelation. Her fingers traced the notebook's worn edges, where her hurried scrawls captured not just the legend, but the way the reflection had twisted her own suppressed grief into something alive, demanding. Relieved determination surged in her chest, a quiet fire pushing back the fog of doubt that had clouded her arrival. Not the monster of folklore, but me. Fractured, yes, but real. The mirror didn't steal. It showed what I'd hidden, my losses, the parts of myself I thought I could observe from afar, untouched. Father Eben leaned forward, his knuckles whitening on the table. "And you'll twist that into your story? Sensationalize our Nadia's torment for some distant readers?" His tone carried the weight of the village's isolation, the fear that outsiders like her would plunder their truths and leave echoes in the mist. Nadia's breath hitched, her eyes narrowing. "It broke me once. Don't make it a spectacle." Mara's mind raced, thoughts coiling like the chapel's creeping shadows. How to bridge this chasm without retreating to the detachment she'd clung to. She slid the notebook across the table, pages splayed open to her final entries. Not clinical notes, but admissions. "Read this. It's not exploitation. I'll tell it honestly. Your stories, Nadia's withdrawal, the bells that mark our thresholds, but mine too. How the reflection eroded my lie of objectivity. Forced me to face the shards inside. No distance, just truth, woven with the care it deserves." The priest's gaze softened as he scanned the words, the intimate script bridging observer and observed. Nadia reached for the book, her fingers brushing Mara's in a tentative touch. A calm responsibility settled over Mara then, like the fog lifting at dawn. Not triumph, but a steady anchor. They nodded, murmurs of agreement threading the silence. The narrative would honor the pain, frame the horror as a mirror for healing, not spectacle. As the bells faded, Mara wondered, unspoken, if this promise of transparent transformation would truly forge the trust they needed, or merely reflect back their lingering doubts.